It was a warm summer morning in London, the kind of day when the sun seemed to hover just a little closer to the earth. Outside Buckingham Palace, the sidewalks were alive with the chatter of tourists. Cameras clicked in every direction as excited visitors tried to capture the beauty of the palace gates. Vendors shouted over the crowd, selling bottled water, ice cream, and miniature Union Jack flags. Wait, before we begin this powerful story, drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. And remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the stories that will stay with you long after they're shared. The highlight of the morning was about to begin, the changing of the guard ceremony. This event, steeped in tradition, always drew large crowds. Parents explained the significance of the guards to their children, while others jostled for a better view of the immaculate procession about to unfold. The royal guards stood in perfect formation, a line of red tunics and towering bearskin hats. Their faces were unreadable, their posture flawless. They didn't flinch, even as the sun bore down relentlessly. The heat was almost tangible, shimmering off the pavement beneath their feet. Among the crowd stood the Parker family, visiting from a small town outside of London. Emily, a 9-year-old girl with a curious nature and a keen eye for detail, held her mother's hand tightly as they moved closer to the palace gates. This was her first time in London, and she had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Emily had always been observant, a trait that sometimes annoyed her older brother, Leo, who was leaning against a nearby railing, scrolling on his phone. At 13, Leo was at the age where little impressed him, and the ceremony wasn't any different. He groaned, "How long is this going to take?" Their mother, Clara, was trying her best to keep the day enjoyable for everyone. "Leo, just put your phone away and watch. This is history in action," she said with a patient smile, though her eyes darted nervously toward Emily, who was already inching closer to the front of the crowd. Clara was used to her daughter's curious nature and knew that Emily didn't always stay put. Emily's excitement was evident in the way her eyes darted around, taking in every detail. "Mum, did you know their hats are made of real fur?" she asked, pointing toward the guards. "Yes, I do," Clara replied, gently pulling Emily back toward her side. "But remember, don't get too close. Let's just enjoy the ceremony from here." As the family settled into their spot, Emily's attention shifted to the line of guards. Something about them fascinated her, the way they stood so still, their uniforms pristine despite the intense heat. She tilted her head, noticing that one of the guards seemed different from the others. He was blinking more often, his posture slightly less rigid. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, glinting in the sunlight. Emily tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mum, that guard looks like he's not feeling well." Clara glanced quickly at the line of guards. "They're trained for this, Emily. It's probably nothing." But Emily wasn't convinced. She kept watching him, noticing how his shoulders seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if he were trying to adjust his weight. The thermometer near the gates showed 34 degrees Celsius, 93 degrees Fahrenheit, and even the tourists were struggling to stay cool under the harsh sunlight. Some had opened umbrellas or used fans to shield themselves from the heat, but the guards remained motionless. The band began to play in the distance, signaling the start of the ceremony. The crowd erupted into applause, momentarily distracted from the rising temperature. Leo groaned again, muttering something about the music being too loud, but Emily's eyes stayed fixed on the guard. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, and his face had turned noticeably red. He seemed to blink longer now, as if fighting to stay awake. Emily leaned closer to her brother. "Leo, do you see that guard? He doesn't look okay." Leo barely looked up. "They're supposed to stand like that. It's their job." "But he's sweating so much," Emily whispered, glancing back at her mother. Clara was busy rummaging through her bag for sunscreen. The crowd around them grew louder as the ceremony unfolded. People cheered as the guards began their perfectly timed movements, marching in unison. But Emily's focus remained unwavering. Something about the guard didn't feel right. The guard's knees seemed to wobble slightly. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she saw him adjust his stance, as if trying to steady himself. She looked around, wondering if anyone else had noticed. The tourists around her were busy taking photos or watching the procession. Emily tugged her mother's arm again. "Mum, I really think something's wrong with him." Clara sighed, glancing at the line of guards again. "Emily, it's hot. Everyone is sweating. Just enjoy the ceremony." Emily bit her lip, unsure of what to do. She felt a strange sense of unease, like she was the only one paying attention to something important. Jonathan Carter, at just 22 years old, was one of the newest members of the Royal Guard. This was his third ceremonial duty since joining the regiment. Standing tall in his striking red tunic and towering bearskin hat, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride every time he took his place in the lineup. But today was different. The sun was relentless, beating down on him with an intensity he hadn't experienced during his training. The woolen uniform, already heavy on a cool day, felt like it was smothering him. Sweat dripped down his back, soaking into the stiff fabric, and his gloves were damp inside. Jonathan blinked rapidly, trying to focus. His mouth was dry, and his tongue felt like sandpaper. He had skipped breakfast that morning, worried it might make him sluggish, but now he regretted it. His stomach churned as the heat pressed harder against him. The instructions from his training echoed in his mind: never move, no matter what happens. Breaking formation was unthinkable. His superiors had drilled this into him relentlessly. But the heat was beginning to win, and the edges of his vision started to blur. On the other side of the gates, Emily's sharp eyes were locked onto Jonathan. The ceremony, grand and precise as it was, didn't hold her attention the way the young guard did. She noticed him shift slightly, just the tiniest adjustment of his feet. To anyone else, it would have been invisible, but Emily's curiosity made her attuned to small details. She leaned toward her mother and whispered, "Mom, look at that guard. Something's wrong with him." Clara, distracted by Leo's complaints about the heat, barely glanced up. "Emily, they're fine. That's their job. They're trained to stand still for hours." Emily frowned. Her mother's response didn't feel right. She kept watching the guard, noticing how his shoulders moved slightly with each labored breath. His face was redder than the others, and she could see a thin line of sweat running down his jaw. She tugged on Leo's sleeve. "Leo, seriously, look. He's not okay." Leo sighed heavily, finally lifting his eyes from his phone. "They're supposed to stand like statues." "That's what they do. You're overthinking it." He glanced at the guard for a moment, then went back to scrolling. Emily's concern deepened. She had a strange feeling in her chest, the kind she'd gotten once before when her neighbor's dog had wandered into the street just before a car sped around the corner. Jonathan could feel the sweat dripping down his temples, but he couldn't wipe it away. The band started playing loudly, the sound filling the square and drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. It was a sound he usually loved, one that gave him a sense of purpose. But today it felt like noise closing in on him, amplifying the heat that was already unbearable. He thought about signaling for help. His training had taught him how just a subtle movement of his fingers or an ever so slight step backward could alert a superior. But what if they thought he was weak? The youngest member of the unit collapsing during a ceremony? It would haunt him forever. Jonathan steadied his breathing, trying to focus on the rhythm of the band's music. His vision blurred again, and this time it didn't clear. His knees felt like they were buckling under the weight of his uniform, but he locked them in place, hoping it would keep him upright. On the other side of the gates, Emily's heart raced as she watched the guards struggle. She turned to her mother again, her voice louder this time. "Mum, I think he's going to faint." Clara glanced over, more out of annoyance than concern. "Emily, stop. You're making a scene." "He's fine." But Emily didn't stop. Her eyes darted between Jonathan and the rest of the guards, who stood perfectly still. She knew something was wrong. Her first aid class had taught her to look for warning signs: flushed skin, shaky movements, and labored breathing. Jonathan was showing all of them. Jonathan's head felt heavy, and his vision turned dark around the edges. He tried to focus on the horizon, on anything to keep him upright. The band played on, and the crowd clapped and cheered, oblivious to his struggle. Just as Emily leaned forward, ready to push through the crowd if she had to, Jonathan's knees gave way. His body tipped forward, the heavy bearskin hat slipping from his head as he collapsed onto the pavement. The loud thud cut through the music, silencing the crowd for a moment. Emily's breath caught in her throat as gasps rippled through the onlookers. Her mother grabbed her arm, pulling her back instinctively. On the ground, Jonathan lay motionless, his face pressed against the pavement. His flushed skin and shallow breathing were now unmistakable. Emily's heart pounded. She knew she had to act. The memory of her first aid teacher's words echoed in her mind. If you see someone in trouble, don't wait for someone else to step in. You might be the only one who can help. The crowd stood frozen, unsure if this was part of the ceremony or a real emergency. Emily, however, wasn't frozen. She took a step forward, her mother's voice calling after her, "Emily, stop." Emily didn't think twice as she darted through the crowd, ignoring her mother's calls. Her focus was entirely on the fallen guard. People around her murmured and shuffled, unsure of whether to intervene or stay back. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, while others whispered nervously. Kneeling beside the young guard, Emily was hit by the intense heat radiating from his uniform. She hesitated for a brief moment, her small hands hovering just above him. "Stay calm, Emily. Just like they taught us," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. She noticed his chest moving, but only barely. He was breathing, but it was shallow and uneven. His face was red, his lips dry and cracked. The heavy wool of his uniform and the thick bearskin hat, now lying a few feet away, were trapping his body heat. Emily tilted his head slightly, remembering her first aid teacher's instructions. "Open the airway," she said under her breath. His body didn't move, but his breathing seemed a little clearer. Looking around, she spotted a vendor selling cold drinks nearby. Without hesitation, she waved frantically. "Water, I need water," she called out. The vendor hesitated, unsure of what was happening, but a man in the crowd stepped in. "Give the kid some water," he barked, grabbing a bottle from the vendor and tossing it to Emily. She caught it and quickly unscrewed the cap. As Emily worked, a shadow loomed over her. She looked up to see a tall man in a red tunic and polished boots. His stern face was framed by the same bearskin hat the guards wore, though his posture was more relaxed. This was Sergeant Evans, the senior officer in charge of the ceremony. "Step back, young lady," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "This is an official matter." Emily's heart raced, but she didn't move. She looked up at him, clutching the water bottle tightly. "He needs help. I know first aid. Please, let me keep helping until the paramedics get here." The sergeant's eyes narrowed, his authoritative demeanor unshaken. "This isn't your responsibility. Move aside and let the professionals handle it." But Emily didn't back down. She glanced around at the crowd, feeling their eyes on her, then back at the guard lying helplessly in front of her. "He's overheating. If we don't cool him down, he could get worse. I can help him right now," she pleaded. Sergeant Evans hesitated, his stern expression faltering for a moment as he looked at the guard. Jonathan's face was flushed, and his breathing was visibly strained. The sergeant glanced at the crowd, sensing their unease. If he dismissed her now and something went wrong, he'd have to answer for it. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Fine. But I'm staying right here," he said, stepping back slightly but keeping a close watch. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her as she turned her attention back to Jonathan. She poured some of the cold water onto her scarf, soaking it thoroughly. Carefully, she dabbed his forehead and cheeks, the fabric cooling his burning skin. The crowd began to quiet, their nervous chatter replaced by focused observation. People leaned forward, watching the young girl with a mix of admiration and curiosity. A woman handed her another water bottle from the sidelines, and Emily mouthed a quick thank you before continuing. She worked methodically, moving the damp scarf across his neck and behind his ears. His breathing seemed to steady, though his eyes remained closed. "Keep him cool and calm," she whispered, repeating her teacher's advice in her head. Emily noticed the sun beating directly down on his face and quickly shifted her position, using her own body to shield him from the sunlight. Sweat dripped down her own forehead, but she didn't care. She stayed there, blocking the heat as much as she could. The people surrounding her began to murmur words of encouragement. "She's doing amazing," someone said. "That kid's a hero," another added. The supportive voices gave Emily a boost of confidence, but she remained focused. Sergeant Evans, still standing nearby, crossed his arms and watched intently. His stern expression softened as he saw the dedication in Emily's movements. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he asked, his tone less commanding now. Emily glanced up briefly, shaking her head. "No, but I learned about it at school. They taught us how to help people who faint or overheat." He nodded, seemingly impressed. "Well, you're doing a fine job." Emily pressed the cool scarf to Jonathan's temples again, watching carefully for any sign of improvement. After a few moments, she noticed his chest rising more steadily. His breathing, though still shallow, was more rhythmic now. Sergeant Evans knelt beside her, breaking his formal posture for the first time. "He's breathing better," he said, his voice softer now. "You might have just saved his life, kid." Emily didn't respond. Her focus remained on Jonathan, silently willing him to wake up. Just as Emily felt a small sense of relief, she heard someone shout from the crowd, "Where are the paramedics?" The urgency in the voice reminded her that this wasn't over yet. Jonathan's condition was stable for now, but Emily knew he needed professional care. She glanced at Sergeant Evans, her eyes full of concern. "How long will they take?" she asked. "They're on their way," he assured her, though his tone hinted at his own worry. Emily stayed by Jonathan's side, shielding him from the sun and cooling him as much as she could. The crowd's eyes remained fixed on her, their admiration growing with each passing moment. Sergeant Evans paced back and forth near Emily, his normally calm demeanor cracking under the mounting pressure. His radio crackled as he tried once again to reach the paramedics stationed nearby. "This is Sergeant Evans. We have a downed guard outside the gates. ETA," he barked into the radio. A garbled response came through. "Traffic's heavy. ETA is delayed by approximately 5 to 7 minutes. Evans gritted his teeth, his frustration evident. He scanned the crowd and then turned to Emily, who was still cooling Jonathan's face with her soaked scarf. Her dedication was unwavering, but he couldn't help feeling the weight of responsibility for the situation. The delay only added to the growing tension in the square. The crowd buzzed with murmurs of concern. "Why aren't the medics here yet?" one person whispered. "It's been too long," another added. Emily looked up at Evans, her face streaked with sweat. "How much longer?" she asked softly. "Soon," he said, though his tone was less certain than he wanted it to be. The weight of the delay was palpable. Emily could feel it too, but she pushed it aside, focusing on Jonathan. She poured the last of the water onto her scarf and pressed it gently against his neck. "We have to keep him cool until they get here," she said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. Evans nodded, silently admiring the composure of this young girl who seemed far beyond her years. In the crowd, Clara stood frozen, her hands clutching the strap of her bag. Every instinct in her body told her to march forward and pull Emily away from the scene. This was her child, her responsibility, yet something held her back. Her mind flashed to a memory she hadn't revisited in years. She was 11 years old, standing on the sidewalk as a cyclist collided with a car right in front of her. She had seen the man lying there, groaning in pain, but fear had rooted her to the spot. She hadn't moved, hadn't called for help, hadn't done anything. The regret of that day had lingered, a quiet shadow in the back of her mind. And now, watching Emily kneeling beside the unconscious guard, Clara realized her daughter wasn't frozen like she had been. Emily was acting. Clara's grip on her bag loosened. "She knows what she's doing," she whispered to herself. But doubt crept in again as she watched the heat of the sun bearing down on her daughter. Was it safe? Should she intervene? "Clara, let her be," said an elderly man standing beside her, noticing her inner turmoil. "She's helping more than most of us would." Clara nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. She decided to trust Emily, even if every fiber of her being wanted to step in. On the edge of the crowd, a woman with a large sun hat and sunglasses, Mrs. Hazelwood, clucked her tongue in disapproval. She turned to her husband, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This is ridiculous. Letting a child handle such a serious situation. Where are the real adults here?" A young man nearby, holding a camera, frowned. "She's doing more than you are, lady," he shot back. Mrs. Hazelwood bristled. "I'm just saying it's highly inappropriate. What if something goes wrong?" This is a failure on the guard's part. Others in the crowd began to murmur, some agreeing with Mrs. Hazelwood, while others defended Emily. A woman with a stroller chimed in, She's keeping him alive. That's more than anyone else is doing. The debate grew louder, the tension in the crowd mirroring the situation on the ground. A man stepped forward, addressing the group. Look, we can argue later. Right now, that little girl is doing her best, and we need to support her. Mrs. Hazelwood huffed but stayed silent after that, crossing her arms and glaring at the scene. The crowd's focus shifted back to Emily, their admiration for her efforts outweighing the dissent. The distant sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tense air. The crowd collectively exhaled in relief as the ambulance finally pulled up near the gates of Buckingham Palace. 2 paramedics, dressed in bright green uniforms, jumped out and hurried toward the scene, their medical bags in hand. Sergeant Evans quickly stepped in to brief them. Heat exposure. He collapsed about 10 minutes ago. Shallow breathing, but this young lady has been keeping him stable, he said, gesturing toward Emily. The paramedics nodded and knelt beside Jonathan. One of them, a woman named Anne, looked at Emily and smiled warmly. You've done a great job here. Tell me what you've been doing. Emily, still holding her damp scarf, explained in a clear but shaky voice. I tilted his head to open his airway and kept him cool with water. He was really hot, so I stayed close to block the sun. Anne gave her a reassuring nod. That's exactly what he needed. You probably made sure things didn't get worse. The second paramedic, Mark, checked Jonathan's vital signs. Pulse is weak, but it's steady, he said. He opened a bag and pulled out an IV line. He's definitely dehydrated. We need to get fluids into him fast. Anne turned back to Emily. You've given us a good head start. Can you step back a bit now so we can work? Emily hesitated, her hand still gripping the water bottle. She looked at Jonathan's pale face and then at the paramedics. Finally, she nodded and scooted back, sitting on her knees a few feet away. The paramedics worked efficiently, hooking Jonathan up to the IV and placing a cooling pack under his neck. Mark glanced at Anne. He was on the verge of heatstroke. Any longer, and it could have been a lot worse. Anne turned to Sergeant Evans. This kid probably saved his life, she said with a smile, nodding toward Emily. The sergeant glanced at Emily, his usually stern face softening. She did more than most people would, that's for sure. As the paramedics continued to stabilize Jonathan, the weight of the situation finally hit Emily. She sat on the pavement, her small hands trembling slightly. Her heart was still racing, and her mind replayed every moment since she had first noticed Jonathan swaying. What if she hadn't acted quickly enough? What if she had done something wrong? Her mother, Clara, rushed forward now that the paramedics were there. She knelt beside Emily and pulled her into a tight hug. You were amazing, sweetheart. Absolutely amazing, Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Emily leaned into her mother but didn't speak. Her eyes stayed fixed on Jonathan, watching as the paramedics lifted him carefully onto a stretcher. Sergeant Evans crouched beside her, his towering presence now more protective than intimidating. Emily, he said, his voice steady but kind, you've got nothing to worry about. You did more than most adults would have known to do. You kept him alive. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide and unsure. Are you sure? What if I didn't do enough? He gave her a firm nod. I've seen a lot of things in my years here, but I've never seen anyone step up the way you did today. You should be proud of yourself. The crowd, now quieter and more reflective, seemed to echo his sentiment. Someone in the back started clapping, and within seconds the applause spread through the square. Tourists and bystanders alike clapped and cheered for Emily, their earlier doubts forgotten. Emily's cheeks turned red, and she ducked her head, feeling overwhelmed. Clara squeezed her hand. They're clapping for you, honey. You deserve it. The paramedics secured Jonathan onto the stretcher and prepared to load him into the ambulance. Anne walked back over to Emily and knelt so they were eye level. We'll take it from here, but I need you to know that what you did was incredible. Most people freeze in situations like this, but you didn't. That takes real courage. Emily managed a small smile. Will he be okay? Anne nodded. Thanks to you, yes, he's going to need some rest and recovery, but he'll be fine. As the ambulance doors closed, Emily watched it drive away, the sirens fading into the distance. The square felt quieter now, the intensity of the moment slowly giving way to a calmer atmosphere. Sergeant Evans stepped forward one last time, placing a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "You're a remarkable young lady, Emily Parker. The Royal Guard owes you one." A week after the dramatic events at Buckingham Palace, Emily was back at home, sitting at the kitchen table with her school books open. The sunlight streamed through the window, but her mind wandered as she replayed the scene in her head. Did she really do enough? Did Jonathan recover? These questions lingered in her mind even as her mother reassured her over and over. The doorbell rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. Clara called out from the hallway, "Emily, someone's here to see you." Emily walked hesitantly to the door, her heart racing with curiosity. When she turned the corner, she froze. Standing there, dressed in casual clothes but still exuding a sense of formality, was Jonathan Carter. "Hello, Emily," he said, offering a kind smile. His face, no longer pale and strained, had regained its color. Emily blinked, momentarily stunned. "You're okay," she blurted out, her voice a mix of relief and excitement. Jonathan chuckled. "Thanks to you, yes. I wanted to come by and thank you personally." He stepped inside, holding a small wrapped package. "May I?" Clara, standing behind Emily, smiled warmly. "Of course. Come in." As they all sat in the living room, Jonathan began to share his side of the story. He explained how the intense heat that day had taken a toll on him and how he had struggled with self-doubt as the youngest member of his unit. "I kept thinking I had to prove myself," Jonathan admitted, his gaze thoughtful. "I didn't want to ask for help because I thought it would make me look weak. But if you hadn't noticed something was wrong and stepped in, I don't know what would have happened." Emily listened intently, her hands gripping the armrest of the couch. I saw you needed help. I didn't think about anything else." Jonathan smiled again, setting the package on the table in front of her. "Well, you didn't just help me, you saved me. And I wanted to give you this as a small token of my gratitude." Emily unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a miniature replica of a royal guard in full uniform. Her eyes lit up as she held it in her hands. "This is amazing," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's a small reminder of what you did that day," Jonathan said. "You were braver than I was. You reminded me that asking for help doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger." As Jonathan left the house, Clara hugged and praised Emily for her bravery. The day dawns bright and cool as Emily and her family approach Buckingham Palace once again. This time, the atmosphere feels different. They aren't just visitors blending into a crowd. Today, they are honored guests. Emily walks ahead with a sense of excitement, her fingers tightly gripping the small royal guard figure Jonathan had gifted her. A palace official greets them at the gates, leading them past the throngs of tourists who cheer and wave when they recognize Emily. Cameras flash as journalists capture the young girl who made headlines across the nation. Emily looks up at her mother, who smiles proudly, and at her brother, Leo, who finally seems genuinely impressed. The official escorts them to a special viewing area near the front of the palace. Emily gasps when she sees the royal guards marching into formation. The ceremonial band plays a lively tune, and the polished precision of the guards mesmerizes her all over again. Among the guards, she spots Jonathan, standing tall and composed in his uniform. His posture is strong, his face focused, but as his line approaches the viewing area, he allows the smallest of smiles to cross his lips. His eyes briefly meet Emily's, and he gives her a subtle nod, a silent gesture of gratitude and recognition. Emily smiles back, her heart swelling with pride. She turns to her mother and whispers, "This is even better than last time." Clara leans down, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "It's because this time you're part of it." As the ceremony continues, Emily clutches the miniature royal guard figure in her pocket, a reminder of how one brave moment changed everything. Emily's story reminds us that courage knows no age. Her quick thinking and empathy turned an ordinary day into an extraordinary act of heroism. But her actions also highlight the importance of being prepared. In moments of crisis, even basic knowledge of first aid can make all the difference. Let Emily's bravery inspire us all to take that step, whether it's learning CPR, keeping a first aid kit nearby, or simply looking out for one another. Because sometimes the smallest actions can leave the greatest impact. Learn first aid. Be prepared. You could be someone's hero.